July 2019. Springfield, a sleepy town in rural Illinois, seemed to be experiencing one of its most peaceful summers. Children still played on the sidewalks at dusk, neighbors watered their lawns as they did every day, and the distant sound of trains cut through the silence of the night. Nothing seemed out of place until Melissa Harper disappeared, a 24-year-old psychology student, known for her discreet smile and for always helping those in need. She was the kind of person everyone liked, but few truly knew. No one imagined that, behind that calm exterior, lay a life riddled with fear, insecurity, and a relationship that was gradually isolating her from the world. That Friday, Melissa sent one last message to her best friend, Jenna. It was short, but it carried something strange, almost like a disguised cry for help. "He's changing. I think I did something wrong." Jenna tried to respond, but never heard back. Hours passed, then days, and Melissa's phone fell silent. The first sign that something terrible had happened came 3 days later, when police found her car abandoned on a dead-end street near the train tracks. Inside, the phone was off, the driver's seat pushed back, the glove compartment open, and nothing else. No sign of a struggle, no trace to explain her disappearance. It was as if Melissa had vanished. The news spread quickly. Neighbors began commenting, local reporters appeared, and social media filled with unanswered questions. Did she run away? Did he do something? The he in the message soon became the center of attention. Derek Wilson, the boyfriend. A calm-looking man, but with a look that seemed to be hiding something. He seemed cooperative in the first few hours, answering questions, but there was something about his calm that was unsettling. While everyone searched for logical explanations, Melissa's mother said with conviction that her daughter would never abandon her family. She was afraid of him, she whispered, through tears on camera. The investigation began slowly, as if no one truly believed anything serious was happening, but all it took was one look at that car, parked on a deserted street, to feel the weight of the mystery. Something there screamed for attention, something no one could yet hear. And perhaps the true beginning of this story wasn't the disappearance itself, but the exact moment Melissa realized the man beside her was no longer the same, and that, from that moment on, nothing would be safe. Stories like Melissa's move us in a different way, don't they? Because it's not just a case of disappearance, it's the fear, the mystery, and that feeling that something terrible is about to be revealed. And those of us here now understand that. We understand the chills, the curiosity, the lump in our throat when something doesn't add up. This is the place for those who feel every detail, for those who believe that every disappearance story needs to be told the right way, with truth, emotion, and a twist. So come join this community of people who can't stop until they understand what really happened. Press the subscribe, leaves the like, and help this story reach more people who, like you, live intensely every second of a good mystery. Melissa Harper was always seen as that sweet, easygoing girl who seemed to have life under control. The daughter of teachers, raised in a simple but loving home, she grew up believing that true love was made of patience, care, and understanding. Those who saw her at psychology school also saw a disciplined young woman, curious about human behavior and passionate about understanding people. But ironically, she never realized that the person she needed to understand most was the person sleeping next to her. Derek Wilson entered her life in an almost cinematic way at the end of 2016. He was the kind of man who immediately caught her attention, confident, charming, always with quick answers and a smile that seemed to know more than he was saying. At first, he was kind. He made a point of picking her up from college, preparing surprise dinners and saying phrases that seemed straight out of a romance novel. Melissa, who had always had trouble believing that someone could love her that way, let herself be captivated. But over time, the little things began to change. First came the comments disguised as concern. "You've been hanging out with your friends too much, don't you think? That classmate of yours seems to like you too much." Then came the subtle criticisms, the repeated questions, the control over what she wore and who she talked to. Melissa thought it was jealousy, a sign of love, as many do when they're in a relationship that's slowly, unknowingly, beginning to suffocate. Her friends noticed the distance. She began skipping dates, declining invitations, and becoming increasingly isolated. When someone asked about Derek, she would smile, look away, and simply say, He's intense, but he loves me. The seemingly passionate relationship turned into a silent cycle of tension. One night in March 2019, a neighbor heard the sound of breaking glass. Melissa showed up the next day with a cut on her hand and explained that she had tripped. The apology was convincing on the outside, but inside fear had already begun to take hold. Derek had a habit of apologizing in tears, promising that it would never happen again. And it always happened again, in a different way, more subtle, more psychological. He began controlling her money, insisted that she quit her temp job, and when she resisted, showed up at work, causing a scene that led her to quit. Melissa began living within a closed circle where everything she did had to be approved by him. Her parents noticed something was wrong, but she insisted everything was fine. She would call with a shaky voice saying she was tired and needed some time. Derek, on the other hand, maintained his image as the exemplary boyfriend. On social media, he posted photos of the two of them smiling, captioned with phrases like "my safe haven" and "she completes me." It was the perfect disguise for a man who knew how to manipulate appearances, and the more the image of a happy couple spread, the more trapped Melissa felt. In June of that year, she began writing in a hidden diary, something that would later reveal how much she had foreseen her own fate. In the entries, she spoke of a growing fear, a constant feeling of being watched, and a desire to escape, which she never had the courage to act on. By that time, she had already tried to break up with him twice. The first time, Derek cried, begged, and said he couldn't live without her. The second time, it was different. He remained silent for a long time, stared at her, and replied coldly, "You'll never leave me, Melissa. I promised nothing would separate us." That sentence echoed in her mind for weeks. From then on, she began planning a discreet exit. She wanted to leave without confronting him, abandon everything and start over. But the fear was greater, and every time she considered acting, something happened. A veiled threat, a strange look, a touch stronger than necessary. Her friends noticed that Melissa was thinner, with dark circles under her eyes and no sparkle in her eyes. One of them, Jenna, even said, "You don't look like yourself anymore." Melissa simply replied, "It's just a phase, it will pass." But deep down, she knew it wasn't a phase. It was the beginning of something that was about to spiral completely out of control. Her last encounter with Jenna was 2 weeks before her disappearance. They were having coffee at a small bistro near the university. Melissa was nervous, checking her watch constantly. She said she had to leave before 9 because Derek didn't like her to be late. Before leaving, she held her friend's hand and whispered, "If I ever disappear, don't believe anything he says." No one took it seriously at the time. It was the kind of statement that sounded like a rant from a woman tired of a turbulent relationship. But days later, when the message, "He's changing, I think I did something wrong," appeared on Jenna's phone, that coffee began to sound like a warning. And while the entire town was buzzing about the young woman's mysterious disappearance, few people knew that Melissa had been leaving small signs of fear for months, signs everyone chose to ignore. As investigators began to piece together her final days, something began to stand out. She had withdrawn money from the bank, bought a bus ticket, and researched shelters for at-risk women. Everything indicated she truly intended to run away, but somewhere along the way, someone found out. And what happened between that coffee shop and the car found on the deserted street is what would make Melissa Harper's case one of the city's most disturbing. Because behind all that apparent calm, there was a silent plan being executed, and no one imagined what was about to be uncovered. Within that relationship that until then seemed like just another complicated love story. On the morning of July 15th, something began to feel off. Melissa's sister, Rachel, wondered why Melissa hadn't texted her as she did every day before leaving for work. It was a custom between them, a quick exchange of good mornings that, however simple, maintained a constant bond. But that day, nothing. No response. No returned calls. The first excuse was practical. Maybe Melissa had overslept or forgotten her phone somewhere. But as the hours passed, the feeling that something was wrong began to grow. Late that afternoon, Rachel called her sister's work and discovered that Melissa hadn't shown up for 2 days. No one could explain why. No warning, no message, just silence. That's when her mother decided to go to Derek's apartment. The door was locked and no one answered. The curtains were closed, his car was parked, but there was no sound from inside. A curious neighbor said he'd heard a loud argument the night before, something like furniture being dragged and a woman crying. Another said he'd heard a muffled sound, like a cry for help coming from inside the apartment, but no one called the police. After all, couples fights happen, as some later commented. It was at that moment that the first clue to the disappearance took shape. Melissa's silence was unusual, and Rachel's fear turned to despair. The police were called, but they treated the case with the coldness of someone who'd seen hundreds of similar stories. She might have gone for a break, they said. Sometimes people need to disappear for a while. No alarm was sounded. No immediate search was initiated. Just a simple report, filed and shelved with dozens of others. But Rachel didn't believe it. She knew her sister. She knew something terrible was happening. When she insisted that Melissa would never go without notifying the family, the officer simply replied indifferently, "Let's wait 48 hours. If she doesn't show up, we'll talk again." Meanwhile, Melissa's best friend Jenna tried to retrace her steps. She went back through her messages, reread each conversation, and lingered on that phrase that now felt like a loud warning. "He's changing. I think I did something wrong." What did Melissa mean by that? What did she think she'd done? Fear began to grip them both, and small memories began to make sense. The way Melissa would tense up when Derek called, the way she'd quickly delete messages, the way she'd look away whenever someone asked if everything was okay. 2 days later, police found her car parked on a dead-end street a few miles from where she lived. The location was isolated, mostly empty, surrounded by trees and close to the train tracks. Inside the car, her cell phone was turned off, her purse was on the passenger seat, and a torn handkerchief was stuck to the gear shift. There were no signs of a struggle, but the air around the car felt heavy, as if the silence concealed something much deeper. It was the moment the story stopped being just a strange absence and officially became a mystery. The first hours of the investigation yielded nothing. No witnesses, no working security cameras, no concrete evidence. But something began to stand out. Derek didn't show up to testify. He told a friend he didn't want to deal with drama and had gone on a trip to get his head together. The police accepted his version, but Rachel didn't. Deep down, she knew the answer to her sister's disappearance lay within that apartment with its closed curtains. Her instincts told her something terrible had happened inside, and as the days passed and the case grew cold, a growing feeling began to grow that the truth about what happened to Melissa might be hidden somewhere where no one was looking. Rachel couldn't sleep. The nights became long, heavy, filled with memories mixed with fear. She replayed the last time she saw her sister, the forced smile, the distant look in her eyes, the hands trembling slightly as she played with her phone. Everything about her seemed to be crying out for help, but no one could hear. Meanwhile, Derek's name was beginning to surface in neighborhood whispers. People remembered the fights, the hard looks, the way he'd followed her in public, always with a control that seemed disguised as care. And the more Rachel thought, the more she realized there was a pattern, a cycle, something that repeated itself, and that was when she decided to dig deeper into his past. At that point, the police were still treating Derek as a collaborator. He'd given a brief, cold, almost rehearsed statement. He said Melissa was stressed, that she probably needed some time away, and he added, without hesitation, that she had a history of drama. The mocking tone in his voice irritated Rachel, who was watching from outside the police station. She knew he was lying, and when she returned home, she decided to search for his name online. What she found made her heart race. Derek Wilson had already been accused of assault by an ex-girlfriend in 2016 in another city, but the case had been dropped due to lack of evidence. Rachel managed to get the contact information for this ex, a woman named Claire Donovan. After days of trying to reach her, she finally got a call. On the other end, a tired, shaky but firm voice. Claire said she'd lived a nightmare very similar to Melissa's. She said Derek was charming at first, but gradually began isolating her from her friends, controlling her, and when she tried to leave him, he kept her locked in her own apartment for almost a week. The police at the time didn't believe her. No trace, no evidence, they said. The pattern was there, clear as day. Derek chose sweet, fragile women, manipulated their emotions, and turned them into prisoners. Rachel took all this to the police, but the agents, caught up in bureaucracy, treated the information as irrelevant until new evidence emerges. Her anger only grew. She knew she was dealing with someone dangerous, someone who knew how to cover his tracks. That's when she began reviewing everything her sister had left behind: the diary, the notes, the old messages. On one page of Melissa's notebook, there was a note made just days before her disappearance. He said he would watch me until the end. I feel like there are no more windows. That phrase echoed in Rachel's mind. There are no more windows. What did that mean? A metaphor, perhaps, or something literal. She began to believe it was a clue, that Melissa somehow was trying to leave signs for anyone brave enough to look. When she showed the note to Jenna, her friend reacted instantly. She said that once during a phone call, Melissa had mentioned that Derek was renovating one of the rooms in the house, and that she had ordered the windows to be closed because the light was making it difficult to sleep. Rachel felt a chill. It no longer sounded like mania, but like preparation. A macabre pattern no one noticed in time. Derek didn't just control, he planned. He created environments of isolation, both physical and psychological. And the more Rachel connected the pieces, the more she felt it was all part of a carefully constructed cycle, one that always ended the same way, with silence. Over the next few days, she began researching everything she could about Derek and Melissa's place of residence. She discovered he had rented the house a little over a year ago, always paying cash. The landlord said he'd never been able to get in after the lease. Derek claimed he worked night shifts and needed privacy. Neighbors, in turn, noticed he always kept the curtains closed, even during the day. Sometimes they heard noises coming from the basement, like something being dragged or hammered, but no one ever approached. Rachel began to write everything down. Times, testimonies, details. The pattern was emerging, and the more she saw it, the clearer it became that Melissa had never disappeared voluntarily. She had been slowly erased, locked in a silence that had a signature, a silence constructed by someone who had done this before and knew exactly how to do it again. The problem was that, even with all the pieces falling into place, no one seemed willing to believe her. With every visit to the police station, every attempt to alert the authorities, the response was always the same: "We need concrete evidence." And time passed. Rachel felt she was fighting something much bigger than Derek. He was fighting a system that only acted when it was too late. But she didn't know that somewhere inside that house, Melissa was still breathing. That days blended into nights in a windowless room, and that, between the cracks in the walls, a secret was beginning to be hidden. A secret that sooner or later someone would find. When Rachel took all the evidence she had gathered to the police, Derek's ex-girlfriend's accounts, Melissa's diary entries, neighbors' comments, everything, she believed someone would finally take the case seriously. But what she found was disregard. The investigator in charge, a tired, slurred man, listened patiently and responded with that same bureaucratic tone that seems designed to crush any hope. Without physical evidence, there's no way to file a warrant. The disappearance is still considered voluntary. Rachel felt her stomach churn. Voluntary. How could someone disappear voluntarily, leaving their car locked? On a deserted street, their cell phone turned off and no bank transactions since. It made no sense. But to the system it did. To the system, she was just another adult woman who probably wanted to disappear on her own. She left the police station angry, a rage that trembled in her hands, her chest, her throat. Her mother cried every day, her father barely spoke, and the neighbors were beginning to avoid the subject, as if the disappearance were contagious. Meanwhile, Derek remained free, walking around town with the calm of someone who knew no one would touch him. He even showed up at a local bar, smiling, chatting with friends, as if nothing had happened. When a local reporter asked about Melissa, he responded with eerie calm. "She was unstable. I hope she's okay, but sometimes people need to disappear to get their heads together." The sentence was reported on the news as a simple statement, but to Rachel, it sounded like a provocation. The feeling of helplessness was devastating. Rachel knew the police had given up before they even began. The days dragged on, and the more time passed, the more the chances of finding Melissa alive diminished. She tried to keep her mind occupied, but the silence of the house suffocated her. She began reviewing every detail of her sister's life, her last calls, her emails, even her saved browser searches. That's how she found a partially deleted history, how to recognize signs of psychological abuse and women's shelters in Illinois. The tears came instantly. Melissa had tried to ask for help, and no one, absolutely no one, listened. Meanwhile, Derek always seemed one step ahead. He knew exactly what to say and what not to say. When the officers called him back for clarification, he responded politely, almost cynically. "I don't want any trouble, I just want to get on with my life," he said. One of the officers, in a later report to the press, even described him as cooperative and calm. Rachel saw this news story and realized how deeply flawed it was. The system believed calm liars more than those who screamed the truth. It was then that she decided to act alone. But before doing so, she tried one last time to convince the detective in charge to look into the case more closely. She showed him a string of old messages in which Derek said phrases like, "You don't need anyone but me," and "There's no point in trying to run away. The world out there is dangerous." The officer looked at it, leafed through the papers and replied, "Without direct threats, this is no good as evidence." Rachel nearly lost it. This wasn't just a lack of sensitivity, it was negligence. And it was at that point that she understood. The real enemy wasn't just Derek. It was also the authorities' indifference. That night, lying on the couch, Rachel reread the last messages she'd exchanged with her sister. "I love you. Don't forget that." That had been Melissa's last sentence before she disappeared. Short, simple, but with a tone that now felt like a goodbye. Rachel cried until her entire body ached, and between sobs she made a soft promise. "I will find you, Melissa. Even if the whole world turns its back, I will find you." Over the next few days, she began to notice something disturbing. Every time she tried to pressure the police, someone advised her to let the matter cool. Even neighbors began acting strangely, as if afraid to get involved. Some swore they knew nothing, others changed the subject. Whenever Derek's name was mentioned, the feeling of isolation was suffocating. It was as if little by little the case was being erased, pushed into oblivion. But Rachel wouldn't let that happen. She revisited the spot where her sister's car had been found. The street was narrow, lined with trees, and the sound of the distant train echoed in the dusk. She stood there for minutes, watching, trying to sense what Melissa might have felt that day. It was a desperate attempt to understand what had happened, but also the beginning of something she hadn't yet grasped. A budding instinct, a force that would guide her down paths the police never imagined. And as the wind rustled the leaves and the roar of the train cut through the air, Rachel knew one thing for sure. Someone was lying, and it wouldn't be long before she proved it. Rachel woke up that morning with a decision made. If no one else was going to look for Melissa, she would, and she would do it alone. The fear was still there, but it no longer had the strength to stop her. Desperation had become fuel and anger, a kind of courage born from emptiness. She started with the basics. She grabbed a city map, marked all the places her sister used to frequent, cross-referenced times, dates, and routes. She spent entire days reviewing old photos, trying to find details that perhaps no one had noticed. And it was then that, in one of Derek's social media posts, she noticed something curious. It was a seemingly ordinary photo. Him, smiling with a mug of coffee inside a house. But behind him, in the reflection of a mirror, Rachel noticed something that made her stop. A piece of blue curtain. Melissa had had one just like it in her childhood bedroom. She remembered it perfectly. The same shade, the same fabric, with little embroidered stars. But Melissa never took that curtain with her when she left her parents' house. Rachel knew this because she herself had stored the scraps of fabric in the attic. So how did that curtain end up in the background of Derek's photo? That detail triggered an alarm. Rachel began examining all his posts with new eyes. Every photo, every background, every shadow. And the more she looked, the more she noticed a pattern. The images always seemed to be taken in the same setting, but with subtle variations. Sometimes the wall was wood, sometimes concrete, but there was always a strange feeling, as if the rooms were smaller than they appeared. And in many of them, there was a recurring element, a covered window, or sometimes not even that, just a plain open wall. Rachel remembered Melissa's diary entry, "No more windows." The phrase came back to her like an echo in her head. She began to scan the map of Springfield and the surrounding area until an old memory surfaced. A cabin on the outskirts of Lake Springfield, a secluded spot where Derek had once taken Melissa early in their relationship, calling it his favorite hideaway. At the time, she'd found it romantic. Now, it sounded sinister. Rachel decided to go there. She grabbed her car, a recorder, and her cell phone. The road was long, lined with tall, dense trees. The sun was already setting when she parked near the lake. The place was eerily quiet, and the wind rustled the leaves in a way that made the air heavy. The cabin looked abandoned. The windows were boarded up, the roof partially destroyed, but the gate, curiously, was locked with a new padlock. Rachel's heart raced. That kind of lock didn't suit an old neglected property. She took photos, recorded a video, and sent it to the detective in charge, explaining everything. "Please, just look at this lock, it's new. Someone comes and goes here." But the response was predictable. "We can't break in without a warrant." And that's when she knew definitively that she was alone. Even so, she returned to her car and watched the place from a distance. Around 10 o'clock at night, she saw a dim light come on inside the cabin. A single light for a few seconds, and then complete darkness. Rachel felt her entire body freeze. This wasn't her imagination. Someone was inside, and all she wanted to do was run to the door and break it down. But she couldn't. She knew that if she did so without proof, the police might turn the tables on her, and Derek once again would get away with it. So she waited. She returned the next day, and the next. And with each visit, she left something different. A note hidden between the cracks in the fence, a small sign, an attempt at communication, even though she wasn't sure if anyone was there to read it. On the fourth day, Rachel began to doubt her own sanity. She was exhausted, sleeping little, eating almost nothing. All she had were flimsy clues and a gut instinct that told her Melissa was still alive. But at that moment, that instinct was the only thing left. She returned home, locked herself in her room, and scattered all her notes on the floor. Dates, locations, names, printed photos. The pattern, that had previously seemed chaotic, began to make sense. Derek wasn't just a violent man. He was methodical. He created isolation zones, always near water sources, places with constant noise that muffled sounds, and the Lake Springfield was perfect for that. Rachel glanced at her watch. It was almost midnight when she grabbed her phone and wrote one last message to the police. "If I'm right, he's keeping her there. Don't let this die." And then, before falling asleep, she glanced out the window and had the uneasy feeling she was being watched. For a moment, she thought she saw a car parked on the corner, but when she blinked, it was gone. And unbeknownst to her, at that very moment, someone on the other side of town was also fighting to keep hope alive. A woman locked in a windowless room, trying to leave a signal so she could be found. The hours began to drag by, and Rachel's body was no longer responding properly. She barely slept, ate little, and lived with the feeling of being followed. Her face showed deep, dark circles, and a look that mixed fear with stubbornness. She knew she was getting closer, but each step forward seemed to bring a new barrier, a new invisible wall that the system, time, and Derek himself seemed to erect before her. And the worst part was, no one believed her anymore. Her mother was too exhausted to insist. Her father had retreated into silence, and even Jenna, Melissa's best friend, began to avoid the subject. "You need to rest, Rach," she would say. "Maybe there's nothing more we can do." But Rachel couldn't stop. Inside her there was a strange, almost physical certainty that Melissa was still alive. The isolation began to take its toll. People looked at her as if she were obsessed, as if she'd lost her mind. And maybe she had a little, but she didn't care. She spent hours retracing routes, analyzing the lake's surroundings, enlarging images on the computer, and trying to find anything that made sense. It was during one of these late nights that she discovered something that made her breath catch. In one of Derek's most recent photos, posted weeks after Melissa's disappearance, there was a strange shadow in the bottom corner of the image. At first glance, it looked like a blur, but when Rachel zoomed in, she noticed a faint reflection, something like a hand trapped behind a glass or plastic wall. It was just a blur, but her intuition screamed. She saved the image and took it to the detective again. He stared at it for a few seconds and laughed, as if she'd just presented a conspiracy theory. "That's just a reflection of light," he said, handing her back the phone. Rachel left feeling a mixture of anger and despair. She felt like she was in a nightmare where everyone could see, but no one could see. On the way back, she pulled the car over to the side of the road and cried until she couldn't breathe. She cried for her sister, for her helplessness, and for having to fight against a wall that wouldn't break. But as the tears fell, she had a thought that pulled her together. Melissa had always believed in signs. She said that the universe gives clues. We just have to pay attention. So if signs existed, Rachel would find them. She began searching deeper. She joined missing persons forums, messaged volunteer groups, and asked for help from people she'd never met. Some ignored her, others believed her. One of these contacts, a man named Tom, a former firefighter, took an interest in the case. He said he'd helped with similar searches and knew the lake area well. There are places there the police never look. They're old cabins used to store fishing gear. Some are on private property and no one has been in for years. His words sparked something in Rachel. That was exactly it. If Derek needed a secluded, controlled location away from prying eyes, those cabins would be the perfect hiding place. Over the next few days, Rachel and Tom began to explore the surrounding area. Each cabin was a new attempt, a new ray of hope. Most were abandoned and covered in dust, but one stood out. It had fresh paint on the lower part of the walls, as if someone had tried to cover something up. Tom bent down and noticed that the ground around it was more heavily packed, indicating that someone had passed by frequently. "This is recent," he said, looking at Rachel. She felt her heart race, but when they tried to approach, a neighbor appeared. A suspicious middle-aged man asked what they were doing. "There," Rachel explained, showed her sister's photo, and quickly told the story. The man was silent for a few seconds before replying, "I've seen him around here. Tall, dark hair, unshaven. He was always carrying boxes into this cabin, but he hasn't been back for a few weeks." His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed something different. Fear. He looked around before adding, "I've never interfered, miss, but sometimes at night you can hear noises inside, like banging or footsteps. And once, I thought I heard someone crying." Rachel froze. The air seemed to leave her lungs. Tom tried to hide his tension, thanked her for the information, and pulled Rachel back into the car. Neither of them said a word on the way back. What the man had just told her confirmed what Rachel had always known. Melissa was there, or at least she had been, and now, more than ever, she needed proof to get someone to act. But the search began to take its toll. Exhaustion turned to fever. Anxiety turned to insomnia, and Rachel's mind began to tear itself apart between pain and hope. She dreamed of her sister every night. Sometimes Melissa would call for help. Sometimes she would just look at her silently, as if trying to say something words couldn't convey. And when Rachel woke, the feeling was always the same. Something big was about to happen. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going at this pace. But one thing was certain. Stopping wasn't an option, because somewhere hidden, Melissa might still be waiting. And what Rachel didn't know was that at that very moment, a trembling hand was scratching a wall, trying to leave a mark, the only sign that hope still existed, even in a windowless room. For weeks, Derek was just a shadow in Rachel's life, a constant presence even when he wasn't around. He didn't speak to his family, didn't meet with reporters, and avoided any direct contact. It was as if he knew exactly what he was doing, as if he'd calculated every step to leave no trace. Until one day Rachel saw him. It was by chance, or perhaps fate. She was at a gas station filling up her car when she recognized that slow, sure gait. Derek got out of a black pickup truck, filled it with gas, glanced quickly around, and walked into the convenience store. Rachel froze for a second, her heart pounding in her throat. Part of her wanted to leave, but the other part, the one that hadn't rested since her sister's disappearance, took over. She entered the store, hiding her nervousness. Derek was at the counter, paying, and for a moment their eyes met. It was brief but intense. He smiled, a cold, controlled smile, like someone who recognizes fear in another and enjoys seeing it. Rachel couldn't say anything. She just watched as he calmly walked out, as if nothing had happened, got into his truck and drove off. But she followed him, not on impulse, but instinctively. She drove at a distance, keeping her headlights low, trying not to be noticed. Derek followed a road that led south of town, then turned onto a dirt trail that bordered a densely wooded area. The GPS stopped working. Rachel pulled over, waited a few minutes, then got out, walking silently through the trees. With each step, her heart pounded. The air was cold and damp, and the sound of crickets mingled with the rustling of leaves. Suddenly, she saw a light, dim, yellowish, coming from a house partially hidden by the vegetation. It was there. Derek was there. Rachel approached slowly, careful not to make any noise. The house looked old, but there were signs of recent use. A running generator, a makeshift antenna, and tire tracks on the ground. She even heard a metallic noise, something like a chain being dragged. For a second she considered calling the police, but then remembered what would happen. They'd wait for a warrant, waste time, and he'd run away again. So, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She grabbed her phone and recorded everything, quietly, describing the place, every detail, every noise. Suddenly a shadow passed by the window. It was him. Derek walked inside the house with a disturbing calm, carrying something in his hands. It looked like a tray, with a bottle of water and a plate. Rachel held her breath. Her mind raced with 1,000 hypotheses. Was he bringing food to someone? Who was inside? Everything in her screamed to run to the door, but the fear of ruining everything paralyzed her. One wrong step, and she would lose her only chance to prove what she had been saying for weeks. Derek turned off the light in one of the rooms and turned on another, dimmer one. Rachel took advantage of the darkness to move closer. That's when she heard something. A barely audible sound coming from inside the house. 3 short knocks, then silence, then 3 more. She stood still, trying to understand. It seemed like a pattern, an attempt at communication. For a moment, she thought she was imagining things, until she heard it. Again, 3 knocks, and then something like a muffled moan. Her blood ran cold. Melissa. It had to be Melissa. Rachel covered her mouth with her hands, trying to hold back her tears. Her whole body was shaking, but the fear was now mixed with a fury she'd never felt before. She grabbed her phone, turned on the camera, and whispered, "He's here. She is too. I know she is." She watched for a few more minutes, until Derek came out of the house, locked the door, and got into his truck. She waited for him to drive away, the engine disappearing in the distance, and then ran to the door. She tried the doorknob. Locked. She knocked, called her sister's name softly, but there was no answer. She pressed her ear to the wood and suddenly heard something on the other side. A faint sound, almost a whisper. 3 knocks, and then silence again. Rachel's entire body was shaking, but now she was certain. Melissa was alive, breathing, and trapped there. She ran back to the car, recording everything, crying, trying to stay lucid. She sent the videos to Tom, the former firefighter who had been helping, and begged him to come over. "I saw her, Tom. I heard her. She's in there." And as she waited for a response, she glanced in the rearview mirror and felt something moving among the trees. A silhouette, maybe. Her heart raced. She sped off, fleeing down the dirt road, her hands shaking, the sound of her own breathing drowning out everything. Later, when she showed the videos to the police, they finally agreed to investigate. But Rachel knew she was now at risk. Derek was no ordinary man, and the look he gave her at that gas station still haunted her. It was the look of someone who knows someone has discovered too much, the kind of look that precedes something terrible. And that night, as she tried to sleep, Rachel heard the sound of a car slowly passing in front of her house. Twice, then silence. She got up, looked out the window, and felt as if the darkness outside was watching her. Back, and somewhere, perhaps just a few miles away, a cold wall held the secret everyone pretended didn't exist. Rachel no longer knew what was day or night. Hours blurred into an endless stream of anxiety and fear. Ever since the day she'd been in that house, she couldn't stop thinking about the sound of the 3 knocks. Short, rhythmic, almost like a code. Melissa was still alive. That certainty was the only thing keeping her going. But along with it came the constant terror that Derek would know she'd been there. And deep down, Rachel knew he knew. Ever since the night the car had slowly driven past her house, the air had felt different. The windows had creaked louder. The street noises had sounded like footsteps. Every sound was a threat now. Still, she didn't stop. Tom, the former firefighter, believed her immediately. As soon as he saw the videos, he said there was no more time to waste. "If she's alive, we don't have days, we have hours," he said, getting in his car and heading to find Rachel. Together, they began to form a plan. They couldn't wait for a warrant. They couldn't rely on the police. They had to act. Tom knew the area and knew how to enter without attracting attention. The goal was simple: get concrete evidence, something that would force the authorities to act immediately. Rachel trembled but agreed. She couldn't bear the thought of Melissa spending another night in that place. They returned to the property as night fell, hiding the car behind a line of trees. The house seemed even darker than before. No lights, no sounds. The silence was almost physical, heavy, suffocating. Tom walked ahead, his flashlight covered with duct tape to avoid direct light. Rachel followed him with her phone in her hands, recording everything. As they approached the door, they saw something different. The lock had been changed. Derek had returned. And, most frightening, there were fresh footprints in the mud. 2 rows, one large and one much smaller. It was as if someone had been dragged. Rachel felt her legs weaken, the urge to scream, but Tom held her back. "If he's here, we'll die," she whispered. They circled around, looking for a back entrance. Then they found a narrow window, partially covered by a loose board. Tom carefully removed it, revealing a crack too small to climb in, but big enough to look through. Rachel took a deep breath and peeked inside. What she saw made her heart skip a beat. Inside the house, there was an overturned chair, a broken plate, and on the floor, what looked like torn duct tape. Beyond, a freshly painted wall, a slightly different color from the rest of the room, darker, as if hiding something behind it. Rachel filmed everything, whispering what she saw, trying to keep her voice steady. Then the sound came again. 3 knocks, dry, coming from inside the wall. Tom looked at her, and they both froze. The knocks repeated, fainter now, but unmistakable. Rachel bit her lip, tears welling up. "She's there. Oh my God. She's there," she whispered. Tom tried to control his breathing, contemplating what to do. He knew that sound. It was the sound of someone trying to be found. They walked away, slowly, silently, and ran back to the car. Rachel called the police, shouting, giving the exact address, describing what she had seen. "She's there, I heard her, you need to go now." The dispatcher promised to send a police car, but Rachel knew it could take hours, so she did the wrong thing. She went back to the house, alone. Tom was still calling rescue team contacts, trying to speed things along, when he realized Rachel was no longer there. She climbed in through the window, ignoring her fear. Her hands were shaking. Her heart felt like it was about to explode, but she couldn't wait any longer. She used her phone as a flashlight and slowly made her way down the narrow hallway. The floor creaked, the air smelled of mildew and rust. Each step seemed harder than the last. When she reached the living room, she saw the dark wall up close. She ran her hand over it and felt that the paint was fresh. There was something different there, a slight vibration, as if air were passing behind it. Then she knocked lightly, 3 times, and the answer came. 3 knocks. Rachel recoiled, covering her mouth to keep from screaming. She had been crying, but now she was crying with hope. "Melissa, it's me. It's Rachel," she whispered. On the other side, silence. Then a muffled, faint sound, like a voice swallowed by the concrete. "Rach." It was barely audible, but it was there. Her sister's voice. Rachel fell to her knees. "Hang on, okay? I'm here. I'm going to get you out of there." She began searching for something to break the wall with. An iron bar. Something. He found a rusty tool near the door and began banging. Once, twice, 3 times. The plaster began to give way, but the noise echoed too much, and it was at that moment that she heard something that chilled her blood. Footsteps. Outside, the heavy sound of boots stomping on the porch's wood. Rachel turned off the flashlight and stood still. Her heart was pounding so hard it seemed to echo through the room. The doorknob turned slowly, and the door creaked open. A shadow appeared in the space. She held her breath, hidden behind the wall, gripping the iron bar with both hands. The silence was so absolute, she could hear the ticking of the old clock in the living room. The shadow took 2 steps, stopped, and then the metallic sound of a key dropping to the floor. Rachel closed her eyes, feeling the tears well up. Outside, Tom was frantically calling the police, shouting that Rachel had broken in. But inside that house, amid the painted walls and muffled sounds, the fates of 2 sisters were beginning to intertwine irreversibly. Because at that very moment, as fear took shape and danger approached, something, or someone, was still banging on the wall, trying to tell her she was alive. Rachel's breath was shallow and uneven, her entire body gripped by an almost physical tension. The sound of Derek's boots echoed through the old house like a heartbeat, each step marking a beat of fear and adrenaline. He was back, and she was inside. Everything in her screamed to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. Her heart was pounding so loudly she feared he could hear it. The silence between one footstep and the next was the kind of silence that drives you mad, that makes your mind create sounds. Imagine shadows. Derek entered slowly, the dim light from the hallway outlining his silhouette on the walls. He carried something in his hands, a flashlight and a piece of wood, maybe a bat, maybe a makeshift weapon. His face was tense, but his eyes scanned the room coldly, as if scenting fear. Rachel backed away slowly, pressing her back against the wall, trying not to make a sound. She could feel the cold concrete seeping through her shirt, the same wall Melissa had been standing behind, the same place where, minutes before, she had heard her sister's faint voice. Rach! It echoed in her mind like a desperate call. She knew she had to act, but any wrong move could mean the end. Derek took 2 more steps, stopped, and turned on the flashlight. The beam of light traveled across the floor, past the chairs, past the broken plate, and slowly rose toward the wall. Rachel flinched, her entire body on alert. For a moment, the beam of light stopped just inches from her, but then shifted away. He still hadn't seen her. That's when something unexpected happened. On the other side of the wall, 3 knocks, faint, quick but audible. Derek froze. He slowly turned his head toward the sound, and the silence became suffocating. Rachel covered her mouth, despair rising within her. Melissa had tried to call for help, but Derek heard it too. He walked to the wall and ran his hand over it, feeling the new plaster. His expression changed. It became hard, dark. Then he knocked again, just once, hard. The sound echoed through the room, like muffled thunder. On the other side there was no response, only silence. Rachel understood what that meant. Melissa had understood it was him. Fear turned to rage. Everything she'd felt in the past few months, the helplessness, the pain, the police's neglect, now coalesced into an uncontrollable impulse. Rachel gripped the iron bar with both hands, her muscles tense, her heart pounding frantically. She waited for the right moment. As Derek turned toward the hallway, she stepped out of the shadows and, with a gasp, struck him in the back. The metallic clang rang out. Derek staggered, dropping the flashlight, which rolled across the floor and illuminated his face in the reflection, eyes wide, wild, filled with hatred. He turned with brutal speed. He grabbed her arm and shoved her against the wall, knocking the air from her body in a moan. "What are you doing here?" he whispered through gritted teeth, his voice cold, almost emotionless. She tried to fight, kicked, bit, but he was much stronger. The iron bar fell to the floor with a crash, and the sound seemed to wake the entire house. Derek clutched her neck, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and heavy. "You don't understand. No one understands. I did this for her. She needs me. She's mine." The words came out brokenly, filled with a madness that no longer seemed human. Rachel struggled to free herself, her hands clawing at his face, and it was at that moment that she heard a noise behind the wall. Something. Falling, maybe a piece of plaster, maybe a blow from inside. Derek was distracted for a second, and that second was all she needed. With a swift movement, she pushed him away with her knee and managed to free herself. She ran to the bar, grabbed it, and struck him again, this time in the leg. He screamed, fell to his knees, but still tried to reach her. Rachel ran to the door, trembling, gasping, but the handle wouldn't turn. It was locked from the inside. Desperation took over. She looked around, searching for an exit, and saw the window she'd entered through. She ran to it, slipping on the floor, her fingers stained with blood and dust. Behind her, Derek limped to his feet, his eyes wide, his breathing animalistic. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his tone almost calm, before reaching out to grab her again. Rachel managed to get halfway through the window and, in a fit of pure survival, threw herself out. She landed on the dirt floor, rolled, and ran. Inside, the sound of banging echoed. He was trying to follow her, shouting nonsense. Rachel ran through the woods, stumbling, her phone in hand, trying to call Tom, the police, anyone. Her voice was almost a sob. "He's here. She's alive, Tom. I heard him. He's following me." The signal was failing, the screen flickering, the sound of Derek's truck engine starting in the distance. The vehicle's lights cut through the darkness, sweeping through the trees, searching for her. Rachel hid behind a tree trunk, her heart racing, praying he wouldn't see her. The engine roared. The light passed inches from her, and then silence. The truck pulled away. Rachel took a deep breath, her entire body shaking, unsure if it was over or if it was just beginning. She looked at her phone, the video still recording, the images shaky, and said softly between sobs, "She's there. I swear she's there." Her cries mingled with the distant sound of the train passing by. And as the truck's lights faded, a question lingered. What would Derek do now that he knew Rachel had discovered what he'd been hiding? Rachel ran without looking back. The sound of the truck faded down the road, but fear still vibrated inside her like a second heartbeat. Her hands shook so badly, her phone nearly slipped out. The video continued recording, the screen illuminating her face in the dark, wide eyes streaked with dirt and tears. She stumbled, fell, and got up again. Each step was pure instinct, a mixture of dread and urgency. When she finally reached the main road, she collapsed on the asphalt, crying. She didn't know how much time had passed, minutes, hours. Time had dissolved into adrenaline. All she knew was that she had to make someone believe. Tom arrived first. His car screeched to a halt and he ran to Rachel. "Oh my God, what happened?" She could barely speak, pointing at her cell phone, repeating between sobs, "She's there. I heard her. He tried to kill me." Tom grabbed her shoulders, trying to calm her, and led her to the car. Meanwhile, the police were finally responding to the calls. Now, with a recording in hand and a desperate statement, there was no longer any way to ignore it. Within an hour, 3 squad cars were on their way to the property. Rachel insisted on going along, but Tom begged her to stay. "Let them do it now, you've already done too much." But she couldn't stand still. It was as if her body was moving of its own accord. When they arrived at the scene, patrol cars surrounded the house with their lights flashing, and the officers advanced with guns drawn. Rachel watched from afar, hugging herself, unable to blink. The wind blew hard, stirring up dust from the road. She looked at the house and felt her stomach churn. The lights reflected off the walls, and for a moment she thought she saw a shadow move inside. Police officers broke down the door. The sound of wood splintering echoed through the woods, and then silence. A tense, suffocating silence. Rachel expected to hear shouts, voices, something, but nothing came. Minutes that felt like hours passed before one of the officers appeared at the door. He was speaking something into the radio, his face pale. Tom ran to him, but Rachel was already moving before she even heard what they said. He burst through the door, ignoring the shouts of warning. The smell was the first thing that hit her, a mix of mildew, fresh paint, and something metallic, heavy. The air seemed thicker, as if the room had held its breath. For too long. The floor was still dirty, the chair overturned, the broken plate in the same spot. But the wall was different. The police had begun to break it down. Fragments of plaster covered the floor, and the sound of sledgehammers echoed in the air. Rachel approached, her heart racing, and watched as the first piece of the structure gave way. Behind it was a layer of wood, then more cement, and then something. A faint, muffled sound. A groan. "Someone's alive here," one of the officers shouted. Rachel covered her mouth, her eyes watering. The sound came again, a weak cough, a whisper. "Please." It was her voice. Melissa. The wall gave way completely, revealing a small, cramped, dimly lit space with an old bed, a dirty blanket, and a thin figure huddled in the corner. Her body trembled, her eyes blinking hard in the light. Rachel rushed forward without thinking, knelt beside her sister, and wrapped her arms around her. "I'm here, Liz. It's okay now. It's okay." Melissa tried to speak, but her voice wouldn't come out. Only tears. She clutched her sister's hand tightly, as if she still couldn't believe this was real. The paramedics rushed in, making room, but Rachel couldn't let go. It was as if, for a moment, the whole world had stopped. All the months of despair, all the sleepless nights, the arguments with the police, the humiliations, the fears, everything condensed there, in that embrace between two sisters who refused to give up on each other. But the relief was short-lived. One of the officers, sweating, called out to his superior, "Sir, there's one more thing." Rachel looked. In the corner of the broken wall, among the rubble, was a note, yellowed, folded, and hidden in the cracks. One of the officers carefully picked it up and read aloud, "If you're reading this, I might still be alive. Please don't give up." It was Melissa's handwriting. The paper looked old, perhaps written days, weeks, even months before the rescue. Rachel felt her Heart sink. Melissa had believed even when all seemed lost. Outside, the ambulances arrived. Derek, however, was nowhere to be found. No sign of him in the house, no clue as to where he'd escaped. Just fresh footprints and the abandoned truck near the lakeshore. Rachel watched as they carried Melissa away, her face pale but alive. She felt both triumph and terror, because even though her sister had been found, the man who did this was still free, and she knew, in a way that didn't need proof, that he wouldn't stop. As the police finished collecting evidence, Rachel approached the destroyed wall and ran her hand over the broken plaster. She felt the paint chips cut into her skin, but still, she didn't pull her hand away. Melissa's voice echoed in her head, faint but determined. "I left a note. I had to try." Rachel closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The worst was over, but the war wasn't yet, because the sound of a distant engine began to draw closer, and for a second, she felt like she knew that sound before, the sound of the black pickup truck, slowly driving down the dirt road again. The vehicle lights were still flashing when the sound of the engine echoed down the road, a low, familiar rumble that made Rachel's body freeze. She was standing beside the ambulance watching Melissa being treated when she felt that shiver crawl up the back of her neck, the kind of shiver the body recognizes before the mind. She looked toward the woods, and there it was. Derek's black truck, slowly emerging from the trees, like a hungry animal returning to the scent of blood. The headlights cut through the fog and illuminated the silhouettes of the officers, who immediately turned. The driver stopped a few feet from the house, the engine still running. For a moment no one moved. It felt like time had stopped, that everyone there knew what this meant. Rachel felt her heart race, her throat close. Melissa, still on the stretcher, opened her eyes and tried to say something, but the sound barely came out. Her gaze searched her sister's, a look of pure terror. "It's him," she whispered, and Rachel understood without needing to hear the rest. Derek was there, and he didn't seem inclined to flee. The truck door opened, and he climbed out as calmly as ever, his hands raised, his face covered in scratches and dried blood. The officers pointed their guns, shouting orders, but he didn't react. He walked to the middle of the road, looked at the house, then at Rachel, and then he smiled. An unhurried, cold smile, the same smile she would never forget. "I told you she needed me," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "and I took care of her." His voice was calm, but there was something disturbing in the way he pronounced each word, as if he truly believed everything he did was love. One of the officers stepped forward, quickly handcuffing him, but Derek didn't resist. He stared at Rachel the entire time, his eyes fixed, intense, and before being pushed into the patrol car, he said in a low, almost whispered tone, "You don't understand. There are things you haven't seen yet." Rachel froze. She wanted to scream, wanted to run to him, wanted to ask what it meant, but her legs wouldn't obey. The sound of the squad car doors closing snapped her out of her trance. Derek was taken away, but the impact lingered in the air, heavy, hazy, like a shadow that wouldn't dissipate even in the light. She looked back at Melissa, now receiving oxygen and IV fluids. Her sister was alive but frail, with marks on her wrists and bruises scattered across her arms. When Rachel held her hand, she wept softly. "I thought you'd never find me," she whispered. Rachel replied, her voice breaking, "I never stopped looking." But something about Melissa seemed restless. Even in her exhaustion, she stared at the floor, at the house, at the destroyed wall, as if something was still wrong. Rachel noticed but thought it was the trauma, the shock of being rescued, until Melissa tugged gently on her arm and whispered with effort, "He wasn't just with me." Rachel frowned, uncomprehending. "What do you mean?" Melissa took a deep breath, her eyes welling up. He was talking to someone, every night. I heard voices. It wasn't just him. There were other people there." The words fell like a blow. Rachel felt the ground disappear for a moment. "More people?" she repeated in disbelief. Melissa nodded, her voice weak, barely audible. "There was another. Door back there. One he padlocked. I heard crying. He said it was the wind, but it wasn't. I know the sound of someone crying." Rachel's body froze. She looked at the house, at the back, which the police hadn't yet searched. Her heart began to beat again, this time with the same rhythm as the 3 beats that had echoed off the wall days before. She took 2 steps forward, ignoring the paramedics' shouts not to move away. She ran toward the back of the house, the ground covered in mud and debris. A police officer tried to stop her, but she pushed him away. "There's someone else in there," she shouted, pointing. They followed her, confused, until Rachel stopped in front of a wooden door, half hidden by the shadows. The padlock was old but sturdy, the same kind Derek used on the front door. She looked at the officers desperately. "Open it. Now." The sergeant hesitated for a second, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. He gave a sharp blow, then another. The lock broke. The door opened slowly, letting out a long, heavy creak. A strong smell of damp and rust filled the air. The flashlight illuminated the interior, a small, windowless room with damp walls and marks on the floor, as if something had recently been dragged. In one corner, a chain was attached to the wall and the remains of a blanket. No bodies, no people, only traces. Rachel covered her mouth, her heart pounding. She looked at the sergeant, who shook his head, stunned. "My God," he murmured. "How many people? Did he bring here?" The red and blue lights of the patrol cars flashed outside, reflecting off the damp walls. Rachel felt a mixture of anger and helplessness. Melissa wasn't the only one. She never had been. Derek had been doing this for longer than anyone realized, and when she stepped outside, feeling the cold air hit her face, she realized the night wasn't over yet. Melissa was alive, but the story, the real story, was just beginning. Because amidst the chaos, one of the officers came running up, holding something in his hands. "We found this in his car," he said, handing over a crumpled envelope. On the paper, just a single handwritten sentence. "She wasn't the first, and she won't be the last." Rachel felt the world spin. The distant rumble of the train once again cut through the early morning silence, and for the first time since her rescue, she understood that the horror hadn't ended there. It had merely changed form. The sun was already rising on the horizon as the tension began to dissolve between the patrol cars and the police tape. The sky, shades of grey and orange, brought a strange sense of calm after a night that seemed endless. Rachel sat in the back of the ambulance, covered by a blanket, watching the movement around her without really seeing. The paramedics tended to Melissa, who was fast asleep, too exhausted to process everything. But even asleep, she flinched at each louder noise, as if the fear was still inside her, trapped in her body. Rachel watched her and felt the same. The fear didn't go away, it just shifted. The distant sound of the train cut through the morning silence, and for a moment, Rachel closed her eyes. That sound had been the last one Melissa heard each night, the constant rumble that hid her screams, and now it seemed to carry the weight of everything left behind. The police hurried along, taking photos, collecting evidence, but none of it brought relief. Derek had been taken, but his presence still lingered, lingering in the walls, the floorboards, the musty smell. Rachel couldn't stop thinking about the note she'd found. She wasn't the first, and she won't be the last. And the more she repeated that phrase in her head, the more she understood this case wouldn't end there. The detective in charge of the case approached, a man with a weary expression and a grave gaze. He held a notebook in his hands and spoke cautiously, as if knowing that any wrong word could bring down a person already on the verge of collapse. "We found more evidence," he said. "At the back of the property, there's a trail that leads to an old storage room. Inside, we found other women's belongings, clothes, documents, shoes." Rachel stared at him, without saying anything, her chest tightening. He continued, "It seems he's been using this place for years. We just don't know how many victims there are." The words echoed like a blow. Rachel brought her hand to her face, feeling her throat tighten. All she could think about was how many families, how many people were out there still waiting for answers, believing someone had simply disappeared, when in truth, they might never have had the chance. She looked at Melissa, at her sister's frail body, and guilt sliced through her chest like a blade. If she hadn't persisted, if she had given up like everyone told her to, Melissa would be dead. And how many others didn't have a Rachel to look for them? The detective walked away, and Rachel stood there, motionless, the morning wind, ruffling her hair, her face still streaked with dust and dried tears. Tom approached and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did what no one else had the courage to do," he said quietly. "She's alive because of you." Rachel took a deep breath, trying to believe his words, but something inside her told her there was more. Melissa had spoken of a door, of voices, of other people, and that back room, with its chains and blankets, everything indicated he wasn't acting alone. She stood, walking, slowly toward the house, ignoring the police officer's stares. The destroyed wall now seemed like a symbol, the barrier between what everyone pretended not to see and what had finally come to light. He ran his fingers over the sledgehammer marks, the cracks in the concrete. That wall had imprisoned his sister, but it also held something more. A story that had not yet been fully revealed. Rachel felt it. The instinct that had guided her there. The same one that had made her believe when no one else did. Now said something else. This was not the end, it was the beginning of something much greater. The sound of footsteps behind her made her turn. It was a police officer, holding an evidence box. "We found more notes, Miss Harper," he said. "Some dated months ago, others much older. There are different names on some of them, and one of them mentions Springfield, 2016. Rachel's eyes widened. 2016. The same year Derek had been reported by his ex-girlfriend, the case that had been dropped. That confirmed everything. He'd been doing this for a long time, and the authorities had let it slide. Rachel felt a lump in her throat. She looked at the ground and whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. He left a trail the whole time, and no one saw it. The officer nodded, unsure of what to say. "Let's run every name. You might have more victims." She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and for the first time in months, felt something other than despair. It was anger, no longer the rage that destroys, but the rage that drives. When she returned to the ambulance, Melissa was slowly waking up. Her voice was weak, but her gaze was more alert. "Is it dawn?" she asked. Rachel held her hand and smiled, tears in her eyes. "Yes, it's dawn." Melissa looked up at the sky for a few seconds, then turned her head and said softly, "I thought I'd never see the light again." Rachel hugged her, feeling her sister's body fragile and warm against hers, and as the sun rose, gilding the trees and illuminating the road where it all began, Rachel made a silent promise. She wouldn't let Derek's name be forgotten, nor those of the other victims. This wouldn't end with a police report or a newspaper headline. She would tell every detail, expose every wrongdoing, give voice to every silenced woman. Because now she understood. Melissa's story was just one among many. And somewhere, maybe in another city, maybe in another state, someone was still banging on the wall, hoping someone would listen. Rachel couldn't return home. Even after the patrol cars had left and the sun had risen high in the sky, she stood there, standing in front of the wooden house, watching the wind seep through the cracks and creak the boards, as if the place itself were breathing. The land was now surrounded by yellow tape, journalists gathered on the road, and drones hovered over the lake. But to Rachel, everything seemed in slow motion. Every sound, every movement, everything became distant. What had happened? There wasn't a simple crime. It was something deeper, darker, something that would leave marks impossible to erase. She walked to the wall where Melissa had been found. The area was empty, only the scattered remains of plaster, the smell of damp mixed with that of new paint. She knelt and ran her hand over the floor, where slivers of the note's paper still remained. It was more than a clue. It was a symbol of resistance. Melissa had fought until the end, even confined, dehydrated and without hope. She believed someone would hear her, and it was this silent faith written in secret that changed everything. Rachel let the tears fall without trying to hold them back. For the first time in a long time, they were tears of relief, but also of pain, because along with the rescue came the realization of how much they had lost. Outside, Melissa rested inside the ambulance, a blanket wrapped around her. She still shivered occasionally, and sometimes, when the wind picked up, she closed her eyes as if hearing echoes from the past. Rachel came over and sat beside her, silent. They both lay there, just breathing together, as if the mere fact that they were alive was a miracle in itself. After a while, Melissa spoke, her voice shaky but firm. "I thought I would never get out of there. Every day he said no one cared, that the world had already forgotten me." Rachel squeezed her hand and replied, "You were never forgotten. I just needed to find you." For a few seconds, the two of them stared at each other, and in that look everything fit. Fear, anger, pain, love, what was left of them. Rachel knew time wouldn't erase it. The scars weren't just on Melissa's body, they were also on both their souls, but there was something different now. A flame, a desire to transform that pain into something greater. Melissa, weak as she was, whispered, "He won't stop, Rach. Others will do the same. No one listens until it's too late." And in that moment, Rachel understood what she had to do. Days later, while Melissa was recovering in the hospital, Rachel began writing. She spent hours transcribing every detail, every memory, every feeling. She didn't want that story to be just a forgotten case in the police files. She wanted people to feel what she felt, to understand how silence and neglect nearly killed her sister. She created a digital diary, a space where she promised to tell the truth of every woman who was disbelieved, of every victim who cried out for help and wasn't heard. She called the project Talking Walls. Soon social media was flooded with messages. Other women began writing, telling similar stories, asking for help, sharing memories. Melissa's case became a symbol, not only because she survived, but because it showed how society turns a blind eye until it's too late. Rachel began receiving invitations for interviews, lectures, and news reports, but each time she told her story, her body still trembled. It wasn't easy to relive it all. The sound of the 3 knocks, the smell of the room, Derek's gaze, none of it went away. One night, weeks after the rescue, Rachel went to Melissa's hospital room. Her sister slept, breathing slowly, her face more peaceful. Rachel sat beside the bed and watched. On the table, the original note was tucked into a clear plastic bag, the same one the forensic experts had returned. Rachel picked it up carefully, ran her finger over the words and whispered, "You saved me, Liz. You taught me to hear what." Silence tries to hide. Outside, the train roared again, the same sound that accompanied the disappearance, the fear, and now the new beginning. Rachel closed her eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time, she felt like she could rest, but deep down, she knew that kind of peace was fragile, because the evil that trapped Melissa wasn't just in Derek, it was in the cracks, the indifference, the lack of empathy that allowed him to act for so long. Before leaving the room, Rachel looked at her, sister one more time and whispered, "We survived. Now it's time to make the world hear." And as she walked down the silent hospital corridor, she felt the weight on her shoulders lessen, but never completely disappear, because somewhere, maybe far away, maybe too close, other stories were still being written behind windowless walls, and someone, at that very moment, might be leaving a note, hoping someone like Rachel would hear it before it was too late. Time passed, but Melissa Harper's story never stopped resonating. The case that began in a small town in rural Illinois grew into something much greater, a symbol of resilience, love, and courage. Months later, the windowless room had been demolished, but its memory remained vivid in the minds of everyone who witnessed the rescue. Rachel, now more serene, still dreamed of the 3 knocks on the wall. Sometimes she woke in the middle of the night thinking she heard them again, but when she opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling, she remembered it wasn't fear. It was memory. It was the sound of a life that refused to fade. Melissa, for her part, began a slow process of rebuilding. The first few weeks were silent, filled with therapy, tears, and flashbacks. Sometimes she flinched at the sound of footsteps in the hallway, or was startled by the sound of the train passing near their new house. Rachel stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, reminding her that the danger was over. Their connection grew deeper than ever, a bond made of pain but also of survival. And in each conversation, Melissa revealed new details, small fragments of the horror she'd experienced, but also of the strength that kept her going. "I wrote because it was the only thing that made me believe someone still cared," she said one day, looking at the framed note Rachel kept on her desk. "When I wrote, 'Don't give up,' it was more for myself than for anyone I met. I just needed to believe there was still someone out there." The Kaki. Project Talking Walls grew bigger than Rachel imagined. Stories began to arrive from all corners of the country. Missing women, ignored families, shelved complaints. What was once a personal pain became a collective cause. Rachel began working with independent journalists, lawyers, psychologists, and even former police officers who regretted not listening to victims in the past. Each new story reopened was a way to give voice to those who had been silenced. And through it all, she learned something. About herself. Courage isn't about not feeling afraid, but about continuing even when fear seems overwhelming. However, not everything was in the past. Derek Wilson's trial attracted national attention. He tried to appear calm and lucid, but the evidence spoke for itself. Melissa's diary, the notes, the video Rachel recorded the night it all happened. Nothing could be denied. During his testimony, Melissa raised her head and looked at him for the first time. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Derek looked away. The sentence came without delay, 32 years in prison. When the judge read the sentence, Rachel closed her eyes, feeling a mixture of relief and grief. There was no happiness, only the certainty that, at least for a while, he wouldn't hurt anyone again. After the trial, Rachel and Melissa visited the lake for the last time. The same lake that, months before, had been the scene of horror, now seemed calm, almost beautiful. The sun reflected off the water, and the light wind made the trees bend in a slow, hypnotic movement. Rachel tossed a stone onto the surface and watched the ripples spread. "It's strange," she said quietly. "It's the same place, but everything feels different." Melissa took a deep breath and replied, "Maybe the place is the same, but we're not anymore." The two looked at each other and smiled, a small, shy smile, but genuine. Before leaving, Rachel left something there, a small wooden box with a copy of the original note. She buried it near the banks, among the roots of a tree, not as a reminder of pain, but as a symbol of hope. "To remind you that every story can be rewritten," she said, looking out at the horizon. Melissa nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. They stood there in silence for a few minutes, watching the sun's reflection dance on the water. That night, back home, Rachel wrote the final lines of Melissa's story on the project website. She ended with the same words her sister had left on the wall. "If you're reading this, I'm still alive. Please don't give up." And as she typed, she felt that those words no longer belonged just to their story, but to all the voices that had once been silenced. She closed her computer and looked out the window. Outside, the distant sound of a train crossing the city echoed in the air. Rachel smiled slightly. The sound that had once represented fear now seemed like a reminder that the worst was over. Life went on. Marked, yes, but pulsing. And in that moment, between the sound of the wind and the roar of the train, it became clear that even after everything, there was still something that resisted, the courage to keep believing. Because as long as there's someone willing to listen, no wall, no matter how thick, can hide a story forever. This story made you feel what it's like to fight against silence, right? Somehow, it resonated with you. It reminded you that there are still voices that need to be heard, and that sometimes all someone needs is someone willing to believe. And that's why what you do now matters. When you like and subscribe, it's not just a click, it's like you're saying, "I heard." That's what makes these stories reach more people, that keeps alive the desire to tell what was almost forgotten. So write the word here in the comments, courage, to show that you're part of those who feel, who care, and who want to continue listening to what the world tries to silence. And let the next video play now, because the story that follows will prove to you that sometimes the truth doesn't hide in the shadows, but in the places where you least expect it.